Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. It's the third week of September 2022 and it's the driest month of the year traditionally, and it has been pretty dry. We're told to enjoy it while it lasts because the Bureau of Meteorology has told us we're approaching our third La Nina in a row, which means wetter than average conditions for the northern rivers in particular. We hope we don't see some of the floods that we saw last year, but the soil is still a little bit damp underfoot, still a bit springy, and you know that water isn't far from the surface if it does rain some more. So I thought I'd show you what the end of the flowering season was like. In my last video I showed you lots of white, beautiful, pretty looking flowers. They look a bit ugly towards the end of it when nut is setting, so they sort of go that brown colour. There's still some flowers here that are actually yet to flower, but right next to it are ones that have flowered, and underneath, if you look closely, there's a few nuts and from flowers that have already finished. Now this tree is a 344, which tends to flower early and it starts setting nut fairly early, and then in harvest season it drops them fairly early as well. I'm happy with the flowering on this tree. That's not repeated on every single 344 I have, but some of these trees here near the driveway are behaving the way they would in a normal orchard. And that brings me to my question that I received from Brad, a new subscriber. And he asked me a question that I thought I'd answered. And he said, look, when you buy a rundown farm, how long does it take to bring it back up to full production? And I was scrabbling around trying to find the video where I'd answered that very question, and I actually hadn't ever done one specifically on the subject, which is a bit silly because I bought a rundown farm and it's now been 3 years since I took it over, and I can give you my own experience as well as what the agronomists and experts were telling me would happen when I did buy the farm. So the advice I received was that you will get the farm back to normal production for the kind of farm you have about 3 years after you buy it. If you farm it conventionally, you follow your agronomist recommendations, you feed it what you're meant to, you spray what you're meant to. It takes about 3 years. And you might wonder why. I certainly wondered why. And it's human nature to think, oh, it won't take 3 years for me, I'll get it up and running in a single year. And lo and behold, in my first year on Nutkin Farm, I got a bumper crop of about 22 tonnes of nut in shell, which was, the highest it had achieved in more than 12 years. And so I was patting myself on the back and calling myself a genius. I thought, oh, this is great, we're up and running, it'll be even more next year. Next season, it fell flat on its face. I barely got 5 tonnes. And this year, the third year, I haven't got the final results in yet, but it looks like it's going to be about 9 odd tonnes, which, it would have been more if we'd had some better harvesting conditions. We only really had 2 harvest pickups, which was a problem because we lost some nut in the rain, and we certainly lost some nut that we just couldn't pick up under grass. So assuming more than 9 tonnes of nut fell on the ground, it would have been a better year, but it couldn't be. So what went wrong? I mean, I've been following my agronomist's recommendations. I've been feeding when he tells me to. I've been spraying when he tells me to. I've ruled out, the fact that he might not be giving me the best advice. I think he actually is giving me the best advice. So why, after such a flying start, would the trees do that? And the best analogy I can think of in terms of what my agronomist told me is it's a little bit like having money in the bank. These trees had money in the bank when they were being neglected. They put on flowers, the pests eat the flowers. They managed to get a few nuts on, the pests eat the nuts. So all the energy that the trees were going to put into that crop never got spent. The money stayed in the bank, if you want to follow the analogy. And when I took over and I protected the flower and I protected the nut, the trees went and had a party. They said, great, let's put on a great big crop. And they spent all their money because, it had just been sitting there in the trees. fairly dormant, gradually building up energy in the tree, even though the trees weren't being actively fed. They're still drawing nutrient from the soil. And so that's why after the first year of sort of this lovely crop, in drought conditions too, I should add, we end up getting 2 fairly mediocre years, which are quite disappointing. And it's easy to lose heart in that sort of thing because, you're doing what you're being told. You're certainly spending the money on putting the inputs into the soil, and then you're just not getting this result. So what does it take to keep a farm at a reasonable production? And the answer to that is it's got to be consistent over years of cultivation. And most of it is to do with a build-up in soil health, which then translates into tree health, new wood that, produces nuts, and, ongoing cropping. And, there's some consistency in the build-up in the soil of nutrient. You then have a build-up in crop, and you can keep things on some level of, equilibrium year after year after year. It's not as simple as giving the tree a bunch of fast food and chemicals and then saying, let's see what we can trick it into doing this year. Fruiting wood on these trees takes years to develop. And once you've got that, it'll start putting on a lot of flowers for you. The flowers then give you the possibility of nut. And I can give you a brief comparison across my own driveway. Here's Nutkin Farm on my left. There's a reasonable performance in flowering. I'm quite happy with that. But they're identical 344s across the driveway over in the nut house here, where I can look at the flowering all the way up and down the side of this tree. And if I had to pick between them, I know which ones I'd prefer. I'd prefer theirs. This farm has been well looked after for well over a decade, regularly fed, regularly sprayed. And even though it has some issues, in the same of mine in terms of a lack of ground cover and a lack of anything to stop erosion between the trees, they are in better health and they're capable of producing a better crop because they've got this rolling, ongoing, year over year over year feeding scenario that allows them to produce. And so, Brad, the answer to your question is, it's about a 3-year period before the tree will get into that rhythm where, it's expecting good soil, it puts on crop accordingly, keeps it all the way through to maturity, and then gives it to you as a product. What else can change or affect that 3-year period? Can you make it shorter or not? Well, I've reached the conclusion you can't really make it shorter. The trees, particularly mature trees, do take a while to respond. It's like turning a ship around. You just can't do it on a 5-cent piece. And the bigger and older the trees, obviously the harder it is to change their status. I've got some younger trees in other blocks of my orchard which did turn around considerably more quickly than these old ones. But, when you're buying a dilapidated orchard, chances are you're actually getting an old, tall orchard that might be a little bit overgrown. Now, in this 3-year period where you're not going to get much of a crop, what else can you do? Now, one of the things you can do is pruning or row removal, if that's your decision strategically, or, those sorts of options. These old Hawaiian varieties will sulk for 3 years after you prune them. So in a way, when you buy a rundown farm, doing pruning in the first year is actually a really good idea, in my opinion, because you're going to get 3 years of subdued crop anyway. I think what you would do is sacrifice the honeymoon crop that you might get, but instead that honeymoon of energy that the tree has might well be put into growing new productive wood after the pruning cuts. So, if you do all that, then commit all your sins at once, I think as a philosopher once said, you won't then be caught up by a pruning speed hump once the trees do, come back to their normal fruiting pattern on good soil. 3 years is also not a bad time frame to address things like soil acidity. Right? The acidity of soil is not something you can fix overnight either with agricultural lime, which is very slow, or Oscal and other similar products that have a quicker effect but still take ages to turn soil acidity around. Obviously, there's a stack of soil, tons and tons and tons of it. You can't change its acidity overnight, particularly when you get down to depths of around 10 centimetres. But you can start working on that in year 1, and by the time you hit year 3, if you've got a decent acidity, what that means is that the plant will more readily be able to access the nutrients you're giving it, and will give it a real boost in terms of what you get out of the other fertiliser inputs you're giving the tree. It means you'll get bang for your buck just when the tree is about to reward you. So that's something you can do. I suppose the advice that flows from this is that I don't think there's anything wrong buying a dilapidated macadamia farm so long as it's meant to be there in the first place, right? If it never should have been planted there, the landscape's too poor, soil's bad, whatever else, then you don't touch it. But this is why you get an agronomist to give you advice on that. If, however, the farm is rescuable and your agronomist gives you a tick, as my one did for Nutkin, you can, start work. But it's best, if possible, to buy the farm with a bit of extra cash to do that work, right? Pruning, row removal, those sorts of things costs thousands of dollars. And if you've spent all your money getting the farm in the first place, but then can't do anything with it, you can be caught in a little bit of a trap, in that you might be able to spend some of what you need on things like fertiliser, soil health, soil acidity, but you might not be able to get the trees themselves into shape for when they come back at that 3-year mark. So think about that if you're going to take on a challenge, the way I took on a challenge. And it's a 3-year period. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you'll be an exception. I haven't heard of any exceptions yet, and I dared to hope that I would be one. And of course, got a humbling blow, and quite happy to share that all with you, and you're very welcome to laugh at me. That's the end of my video, guys. I hope you have a lovely day, whatever it is you're doing. I'm going to get into some work to prepare the water channels for more rain, getting out with a slasher tomorrow and seeing how I go with that. So I will bring you another video again very soon, and looking forward to talking with you again.